Kevin. And hello, Robina. It's lovely to have you with us. Yeah.
Yes, Craig, for sure. And thank you so much, Kevin. It's so fantastic. And happy to know you're all there. I can't see you all, which is I just have to know that you're there, okay? It'd be nice to see all your faces, but what to do?
Yes. I'll just say a couple of words by way of introduction, but the Venerable Robina Courtin, a Buddhist nun in the Tibetan Buddhist Gelugpa tradition, ordained in the late 1970s. And you've also worked for many years with the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition and served as editorial director of Wisdom Publications, editor of Mandala Magazine, executive director of Prison Project, and a touring teacher in Buddhism. And we met, I think, on a large conference, Happiness and Its Causes,
Yes,
some years ago up in
that's
Sydney.
right.
And the Dalai
Yep.
Lama
Yes,
was
yes.
presenting at
I
that as well.
remember.
Mm,
Exactly. I remember well.
yeah,
Yeah.
you've done a lot. One of the notable things, and there are so many, too many to name, but worked a lot
Mm,
with prisoners, and you've been featured. Your work in prisons been featured in documentaries, Chasing Buddha and Key to
mm,
Freedom. So
mm,
we're going to be exploring from a Buddhist perspective, contemplative practices and how they can shed light on understanding self, mind, meaning, and I
mm.
think enlightenment would be good by the end of this webinar if you could
Good.
arrange that.
We'll do our best. I'm
Do
renowned for speaking very fast, so we can see if we can squeeze it all in.
we'll cover a lot of ground, I'm sure.
Yes.
Rabina, I think the first thing just be wonderful for people to get to know you a bit more. And you had a very colourful and I don't think I'd be wrong in saying unconventional path to becoming a Buddhist nun. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and some of the
Well,
twists and
yeah.
turns you went through?
I mean, when it's your own life, you don't kind of, well, I don't think of it as whatever it is, but perhaps it looks like that. Yeah, I was born in Melbourne, family of seven kids. My mother was and I was born, as you can see, if I was born in the mid 1940s. Seven kids in the family, Catholic mother. Not my father wasn't. He was a journalist. My mother was a classical musician, and they had babies very quickly. I think they had eight in about 9 years, so they're quite quick. My poor darling mother, she was going to be this famous singer and musician, but suddenly landed with all these babies. And then we weren't very rich or anything, so but she sent us to the best convent. I went to Sacre Coeur in Glen Iris in Melbourne. There's a sister convent of that big fat one, that fancy one in Rose Bay in Sydney. So I mean, but from the first time as a little girl, I was in love with God. As soon as I went to mass, I announced that's my job. I'm going to be a priest, you know. So I think I was so young that intellectually I didn't comprehend when they said, "Sorry, Rabin, you're not a boy." So they said, "Got to be a nun." So I thought, okay. So basically, I mean, I was on one side, I was kind of really totally rebellious, totally kind of no one can tell me what to do. But at the same time, I had this kind of inner world, you know, I'd call it religious, in love with God, trying to work out the meaning of life. And that was kind of really sincere, but it didn't ever show on my outside. So but then I left school, but I didn't want to study. I thought it was totally boring. I looked at universities and thought, how boring. What is there for me? It just seemed so staid and boring, basically. So, I mean, I was about 15 or 16. I was studying music. And then by the time I was 20s, I'd kind of decided giving up God. Hello, boys. It was the 60s by then. Went to London, a bit of revolutionary for about 10 years, I think. I mean, the only way to put it is I was really looking for a way to see the world. I wanted a framework for the world, you know? So first it was like Catholic. I kind of joked that I blamed all the non-Catholics for the problems. Then I became a hippie, so I blamed all the straight people for the problems. Then a bit of an old radical lefty in London, and blaming all the rich people, and then all kind of the political world, and I mean the imperialist world, blaming all the white people, and then finally blaming all the male people. I became a feminist, you know. So I think I joke and say that by that point, 10 years of it, intense 10 years of activity and inner searching, I wanted something spiritual again, bumped into these Tibetans in Queensland, actually, Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, and they said, perhaps you should be looking at your mind, Rabina. So I never thought of that in the past. That was a brand new idea. So I've kind of been doing that for the last 50 years, I'd say. Basically that. So, I mean, I don't know if I don't know if it's unconventional, but that's how it was. And then on the way, I was doing martial arts and my mother was a singer, so she had hopes for me to be a classical singer too. But that was it. I was strong. If I look back, it was a very clear path. It looks not clear on the outside, but on the inside, it was very clear. I wanted to understand the meaning of life. What's the point of life? What is happiness? What is suffering? These things. So here I am with the Buddhist view still unfolding. It's still so far so good, basically.
It's interesting, isn't it, how you can have a sort of a constancy of searching within, but
Yeah,
outwardly it seems to be all these twists and turns, and
totally
there's
looks like.
something.
I mean, yeah, that's right. My poor family felt so sorry for poor Robina. She didn't seem to want a husband and babies. I mean, I tried getting happiness with boys. I tried to get happiness with girls. I tried all sorts of ways, but now they kind of think I look reasonable now.
Yeah, so now Buddhism, many would consider it like a science-based
Yeah.
rather than a faith-based religion.
Yes. Yes.
Questioning and inquiry, etc.
Yes.
Is that true? And if so,
Exactly.
can you say a little bit about
Yes.
why it is?
Why? No, I think it's a totally logical reason. Is that, and this is not evident on the surface. I'm not, especially with all the Buddhists, because they've all come from these very traditional cultures. We've discovered them. I mean, we in the West really have only sort of strongly discovered Buddhism, as we all know, in the last 50 years, maybe, or perhaps since the hippies, or certainly Tibetan Buddhism, when they all kind of landed in Kathmandu looking for enlightenment and drugs simultaneously. I never know why, but that's how we looked at it. But it's very clear and logical that the Buddhist view is not based on faith, because basically Buddha doesn't assert a creator. And that's very, if we look at the religions of the world, the big religions of the world, there's the Judaism, Christianity, Islam. The one thing they do share is this very clear concept of an energy that's external, that's perfect, and that is literally, I mean, literally the source of the universe, the source of me, who runs the show, who sets the rules. And that's why I think we have this very powerful, the Buddhism would say, a dualistic view of punishment and reward. If you're a good girl, I'm not being sarcastic, but if you're a good girl, you get rewarded, which means you go to heaven with God. And I'm not being sarcastic. And in fact, even I think I have a Jesuit priest friend, because I was a Catholic and I like all these discussions. I asked him that what by definition is a negative action. Buddhists would say a negative action or an immoral action. And by definition for Catholics, it was very clear, and perhaps all Christians and Muslims too, by definition, something is wrong because God said. And I'm not criticizing that view. I think you live a very happy life if you have faith in God, because at least someone's got a plan, and you have faith. And by definition, you have to have faith, because how can you possibly prove God to be right? That's about the worst possible thing you could ever do if you assert a creator, a perfect, omniscient being who is the source of the universe. So the Buddha's view, I mean, he came out of the Hindus, as we know, maybe 2,500 years ago. And I remember Dalai Lama always saying, you know, it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago. They were the ones who began the investigation into self. And that's not, I think that sounds pretty good. Buddha came out of that system. And this actually really sophisticated, incredible system of these amazing yogis and scholars and in fact, meditators. And I think we could also say they discovered the mind. I mean, they didn't invent the mind. The mind's there, but they discovered the mind by utilizing this amazing technique that they use that digs deep into your being. And we can discuss this if you like, whatever, the thing that meditates, the thing that, and so for the Buddha, he has observed, that's the point about him. Anything he says is from his own observation. It is not mere belief. It is not, speculation. It is not, you must believe this. I remember quickly, I always have this worry we've got so much time, but we'll see what we can follow, we can cover. But the crucial point I'm getting at is in New Zealand one time doing a talk, this guy who happened to be a scientist, he said to me, who revealed the teachings to the Buddha? And I said, well, would you ask Einstein who revealed the teachings on relativity to him? And of course, we all laughed because we wouldn't. That would be silly, because we know he used his intelligence. He observed the world with his own mind. He didn't look in the sky. He didn't speculate. He used rigorous intelligence and then came up, observed things, came up with different findings, and then presented his findings once he was confident and said, this is how I found to be true. And don't believe me. This is my methodology, over to you. And that's exactly the Buddhist approach. I mean, no more or less than that. And Buddha says, and the other thing what he's observed is we don't need creating, basically, because our consciousness, they don't use the word soul, our consciousness, which they have observed is not physical at a subtler level, is a product of the continuity of cause and effect. So by definition, how can you have a first cause? So something like that, really. So there's no concept of creator. And as they all say in Buddhism, if you can prove what Buddha said is wrong, Dalai Lama says that to us modern people, who have a tendency to just want to believe it if it's religious. No, you go one step at a time, following the methodology. And if you get to a certain point where what Buddha said would be isn't, like to Einstein, then you must reject him. That's the approach in Buddhism.
Yeah. So I remember in my own experience when I was growing up,
Yeah.
Recognizing one time in my teenage years, I was all nervous and anxious about an upcoming event.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I had a moment of awareness of seeing that I was living in a kind of an imaginary future. There was an
Uh-huh.
imaginary me doing things in the imaginary
Okay.
future.
Yes.
And all of a sudden it occurred to me that these feelings physically and emotionally that were uncomfortable were related to my mind projecting a little world in the
Yeah,
imagination.
that's it.
And I
Exactly. Which
wondered
seems
how,
so obvious, but but to say it's like a revelation, isn't it? But it's sort of obvious, really. But yeah, you're exactly right.
so that, I mean, I used to think when I was young, like doing experiments, as it were,
Yeah, yeah.
in how to work with uncomfortable feelings and how to
There you go.
get less caught up in them and so on. So
Uh-huh.
this kind of methodology, this is that the kind of thing you're talking about that
Well,
from
I mean, no,
your
even in a
direct
more simple
experience?
way, I hear it. In a more simple way, you could actually say that what Buddha has, and we have to keep assuming this has come from his own experience. We can take that or leave it. That's why I like to say I'm taking Buddhism as my working hypothesis. What he's saying effectively is that happiness and suffering, the main source of it is not the objects of the senses, and this is not meant to be moralistic. It's not sex and drugs and rock and roll, or the weather, or your boyfriend liking you, or anything external. They all play their role, but the main cause of happiness and suffering, in fact the creator of the universe, the Buddha would say, is in the mind. And so this is why their view of the mind, and you've got to really understand this, based on these genius Hindus, these Indians, this technique that the world vaguely knows as mindfulness is actually this astonishing psychological skill that enables you to plumb the depths completely of the grosser level of conceptuality and sensory to access a subtle level of mind that sounds to us like science fiction, and that's not posited. The Christians would say it's kind of the soul and it's mysterious, but this technique enables you to go deeper and ever more subtle, ever more subtle, ever more subtle, to a level of consciousness which is basically the capacity for cognition, to be utterly vast and clear and completely crystal clear, and to go and then to remove from that mind the neuroses and the misery that is the source of our pain. That mind, for Buddha, mind is fundamentally clear and pure, and we all have the potential to be simply clear and pure and beyond suffering and totally in touch with reality. That's actually what Buddha is saying. And that's why the job of having to go deep into your mind, not to sort of feel good, but the level of consciousness we would assert, I think, in neuroscience and psychology is only the very grossest level, the tip of the iceberg. Conceptuality and sensory even. In fact, the Buddhist view would be, and this is where the Hindus too, they discovered subtle levels of mind that don't depend upon the brain. And that's where, of course, one has to look into that, because that's a bit of a contradiction in the world. Mind's way more subtle than we can imagine, and it has this potential to be utterly beyond neuroses, and the Buddha's saying the causes of suffering are in the mind and the causes of happiness are there. And so to dig deep and unpack and unravel your mind is what you're doing really as a Buddhist, based on this idea of concentration developed from these techniques. It's an intensely internal job.
The Dalai Lama has very much encouraged the pursuit of science, the scientific investigation
Absolutely,
of
yeah.
mindfulness, meditative practices, and
Yeah,
so on. And I remember him saying, like, well, if they're not backed up by science, if they don't stand up to scrutiny, well, then
that's right.
doing them because and do something else that might
Yeah.
work. I mean, we often think of religions per se and science as being kind of
Contradictory.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, exactly.
so this relationship between science and Buddhism and
Mm.
and the limits of what science can tell us. Can you say something about
Well,
that?
it seems to me the scientific one is the approach, but perhaps I think we take it as a given, and I would disagree with that science equals the physical world. The scientific approach is the point, observing something, then you learn to look into it and you check it out, and then you find you come out, you sort of come up with a law, and then you codify it and prove it, and then present it. So it's either true or it's not, and that's a bit shocking in religion, because that sounds like you've got to believe, because by definition in all the religious approach it can use, I mean, all these intellectual Christians and people who study for years all the stuff that is intellectual, but finally the whole idea in the Buddhist approach is that reality is a certain way. This is where all these teachings on emptiness and the absolute, which sounds very cosmic to us. Reality is a certain way, and we we are not, because we're not in touch with it, we are then neurotic and confused and cause suffering to ourselves and others. And so the whole approach of getting wisdom in Buddhism is not separate from ethics or morality, and it's a method of getting happy. So it's a gradual, ongoing process. It's the scientific approach that we're discussing, not so much whether you're analyzing a flower or consciousness. It's the same approach. In the end, for the Buddhist approach, absolutely it's that.
So the same inquiry, whether it's the things on the physical level, but to the mind as well.
Yeah, that's the point. That's exactly right. What is real? I mean, in fact, what is real and what is not? What is reality? What is not? That's very much the Buddhist approach. And that's what I think is very interesting. We appreciate in our modern world. The best on the planet are the ones who are most intelligent, especially if they invent incredible things. We admire wisdom, but the Buddhist idea of wisdom, it's inseparable from good ethics. To be able to dig down deep into the mind and unpack and unravel the neuroses and the voices of ego and go beyond them. That's what brings wisdom, but simultaneously it brings ethics and goodness and happiness. These come together. I mean, you can be the best and most intelligent person on the planet, but still go home and beat up your husband and children. So wisdom is, there's a nice analogy we use that a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So compassion is empathy and the wish to benefit others, but it's absolutely rooted in the first stages of practice, which is developing wisdom. It's not which means getting rid of the neuroses which cause us to be unwise and ridiculous and to suffer. So once you've achieved these certain levels of liberation from suffering and its causes, you are totally happy and joyful and empathetic and therefore useful and practical.
Is that is implied in that you couldn't really be awake and lacking compassion at the same time. You couldn't
Not
really be
possible.
awake and be
Impossible.
cruel to
Impossible.
somebody at the same time.
Yeah, because the way they talk about wisdom, the development of wisdom, when you finally realize ultimate reality, which is not meant to be cosmic, then the very being at the moment of ordinary beings, of being separate from others. And we can all see it. The more miserable you are, the more depressed, the more angry, the more jealous, the more crazy, the more literally you're cut off from the universe. As you work on your own mind, become less neurotic, more stable, and therefore more joyful, you break down the barriers that this ego has constructed between self and other. And eventually you could argue, when you really get rid of the rubbish, which Buddha says we can, you're naturally incredibly connected to other beings. There's no, and you don't, right now we just see them all in terms of how they satisfy my needs, basically. What the friends and the enemies and the strangers, it's all based on, I mean, this, anyway. But yeah, the closeness, the more we work on our own mind and become wise and clear, the more we connect and become empathetic to others. They can't be contradictory.
So this sort of compassion, being pro-social, caring, that's kind of innate. It's in our DNA. But so is it a matter of other things come in and condition us out of that or distract us out of that so that we're not actually
Well, look, I mean, the Buddhist way of saying, because we're taking on board the view in Buddhism that our consciousness comes from before. Just this is our hypothesis here, so I'll talk on that basis. We come into basically this is where the business of karma is, and it's basically a simple. Buddha has observed that it's a natural law that whatever any mind thinks or does or says, millisecond by millisecond, animals and humans as any other beings that there are, that's the natural process that produces the person we become. Not only just of course, from past lives, we come into this life program, not with our mothers and fathers stuff, big shock. I mean, but with our own stuff. And then everything we think and do and say now produces the person we will become. It's a totally dynamic process. We're not just merely the product of the outside world. That's a bit dualistic for the Buddha. We produce ourselves in a sense. So that's really the meaning of karma. So if you keep practicing music every day, you're not surprised you get better at it. So the Buddha's deal is if you keep practicing anger and jealousy every day, don't be surprised you're miserable. So we have the ability to become utterly familiar with our own mind, identify the stuff that's in there and unpack and unravel it and produce this marvelous, happy, ethical, wise person that's also beneficial to others. That's the bottom line, really.
Well, going to sort of, well, move perhaps on with the topic, and you just mentioned about, this sort of knowing ourselves in a way. And over the entrance to the temple at Delphi were inscribed the words "Know thyself," and
there you go.
Socrates is said to have said that the very essence of wisdom is self-knowledge. So why does knowing oneself matter?
Well, if we're taking this Buddhist view, which I think we can actually look into and we can kind of think, I think we can prove to some degree it's true. If the second we wake up in the morning, isn't it? what are we involved in? We're involved in basically the objects of the five senses. The outside world is profound, is just utterly dominates our lives, doesn't it? So that's called sensory consciousness. Your eyes are working, your ears are working, and so naturally that's where we think happiness is. That's where we think suffering is. So we go out there, we try to avoid the ugly things and get the nice things. And of course we know we've got this chatting mind, but why would you pay attention when you can see the delicious cake and the nice boyfriend and the lovely music? That's what's so compelling. And this again is not a moralistic issue. So then we don't want to bother knowing ourselves. It sounds so boring, you know. But only we all, and so we all know though, when the outside world starts not giving you what you want, then all the panic attacks arise. Then you can't help but notice the craziness, and then we never can think that we work on it. We think, oh, that's just the brain. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the brain, but the Buddhists, I would say, without insulting all the neuroscientists, that it's the physical indicator of what's going on more deeply. So it just seems reasonable if I'm craving and grasping that boyfriend out there, and then when he doesn't look at me right, I have a mental breakdown. My mind is breaking down, so I better become familiar with it. So I'd stop it breaking down. You know, I can have control over it. And if I want to be happy, I notice the cake, you know, tastes good, and then suddenly 4 pieces later it doesn't. You start, and then you notice all the thoughts there. But more recently, we are now paying attention to it. But even it seems to me our view in therapy and psychology, you wait till the wheels are falling off before you go anywhere near looking at your mind. The Buddha's simply saying, no, if you start your day with it, start your life with it, and you become familiar with the anger and the misery before it vomits out the mouth, you'll benefit from that, Robina. You know, it's a practical issue. It's a really practical issue. It's not mystical. You know, and we can prove that what goes on in our mind determines the way we feel that day. One day you can be profoundly depressed and everybody looks horrible. Next day you're a bit happier and suddenly it looks bright and the weather's no different. Your boyfriend looks no different. So I think if we think of it this way, we can prove it's true. But we're so addicted to this approach, you know, and then yeah. So that's some of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
it make sense?
Oh yeah, yeah, totally. I
And
mean,
any decent thinker over the centuries, I like to think that there's so many humans, we're all trying so hard to find out the meaning of life, whether we're a scientist or a Hindu or a Buddhist or an Australian Aboriginal. I mean, it should be great. And I think many humans over the centuries have observed many similar things. You know, it's really clear. You know, there's such common ground.
so when we talk about knowing ourselves, what is it
Yeah.
that is being known, and what's doing the knowing?
Yeah, I
What
understand.
is
So,
self and
okay,
what
this is the
isn't?
word. Okay, this is very nice. This is why the Dalai Lama says the Indians were the one who began the investigation into the nature of self. So the word self for them, of course, is really the equivalent, certainly in Christianity and other religions, of the word soul or spirit. There's some extra component. There's body and mind, and then they called it Atman or self, you know. So of course, the way we use the word self in the West, I don't really quite know what we even mean by self. But this is really, as Dalai Lama says, they began the investigation. So the Buddhist idea, you know, is that things do exist. There is a toilet, there is a phone, there is a person. You and I qualify as a person. We're not a computer or a toilet. So you define something, it functions, it is there, it does its job. But basically the Buddha is saying we over exaggerate its status. So the self, you could argue there is a person, self, and me, for example. Those words are synonymous in Buddhist psychology. So we are a person. We can't say we're not a self. Instead of being an apple, we're a self. We're a person. We're a person, a self, a me, and myself. These words are synonymous. But he says we over exaggerate. We kind of, as one of my teachers, Lama Zopa, says, attachment and this ego grasping, they decorate on top of what is there, kind of layers and layers of characteristics that aren't there. So we're like drama queens that exaggerate everything. We make mountains out of molehills. So when you start looking into the nature of yourself, you don't chuck the baby out of the bathwater and become nothingness. That's nihilism. You just get a more subtle, if you like, the self that does exist, you could put it that way, is a more subtle, kind of more moving, subtle, dependent kind of thing that functions, you know. But we give everything too much concrete meaning, which is the cause of so much pain. That's how you'd say it, I think, one way of saying it. So it's not as if there's no self. Chuck the baby out of the bathwater, oh, might as well die, there's no self. That's a appalling idea. That's evidently not true. So the self is just a word we refer to us as opposed to a statue or a light. It's a person, you know, a person. And we function in a certain way, but we kind of all believe there's some special little me in there with the capital letters that runs the show. And that's the self that Buddha definitely says does not exist. It's a fantasy.
Is one of the problems we identify ourselves so much with sensations that come in through the body and the thoughts that are passing through the
Yeah,
mind.
that's right.
There's an
Yeah,
emotion like anger and I am
yeah,
angry, or there's a
that's it. Exactly. All that. That's exactly right.
so so are the practices about breaking down those sort of attachments and then there's a sense of just observing an emotion or a thought or an opinion or something else, but with less attachment to it. So
That's
is it
certainly part of that is very much part of the process. There's so many approaches to it actually, and in the different traditions there are very different, very many approaches. So, one of the ways they talk in Tibetan, and they actually talk this way when they discuss, that they don't say, I am angry. They say, there is anger. There is this, there is that. It's a much more objective way, and they all function in their own way. And so, so part of the process is to observe all the thoughts, and even the positive ones, the negative ones, whichever ones you like, and realize they are parts of the me, they are parts of Robina, but again, not to give them too much status, not to sort of over exaggerate everything. It's a relative reality that there is Craig, here is Robina. I mean, this is convenience and language. And finally, they say, I mean, the Buddhist, this approach we talk very much in the Tibetan Buddhist, that you keep digging deeper, ever deeper, looking for this little inherent, little intrinsic, separate little me that runs the show, which the Buddha would say does not exist. Here's where he diverged from the Hindus. That little subtle little boss me doesn't exist. And it sounds kind of tricky, but we think there's the body and the mind, and there's a little me is like the puppeteer, but that one does not exist. So there's just the thoughts. They are not me either. We say, I'm angry. And then we paint the whole of us with the anger. And then suddenly you feel good one day. Oh, I'm so important. So it's all exaggerating. It's always exaggerating. So the whole thing of the two truths, like they talk about, there is something existing, but at the same time, there's something inherently existing. And to put these two together is quite tricky,
yeah.
in the
Well,
mind.
well, taking some of these things, which I think that non-identification with thoughts and feelings and so on,
Yeah.
you find it in many wisdom traditions, but it's
Yeah,
particularly elaborated on in the Buddhist tradition. But the way that
definitely. Yes.
mindfulness, which many would sort of see arising, or some of the leading practitioners coming out of a Buddhist tradition, but it seems to have
Yes.
been so helpful in alleviating those forms of suffering that we put words like depression and anxiety on them. That ability to observe the thought,
Yes.
feeling,
Because
sensation.
the thing is, we identify with them. That's something. As soon as we say there's anger, suddenly the whole of yourself is now seen in terms of being an angry person. So of course that's how we identify ourselves, and it's the same as how I identify other people. One action, my boyfriend does one wrong action, and the whole of him appears ugly, and that's just a simple exaggeration. And as soon as that's what depression is. It's internalized anger and guilt. The whole of me is bad. It's very evidently not true, but it's very strong impulse, a very deep habit.
Is there a kind of awareness or consciousness that is beyond the thinking mind and so on? And
Oh, the Buddhist view. I think that's the revelation from these genius Indians. Quite literally, with this brilliant skill called, which is what mindfulness is based on. I mean, the levels of concentration that they cultivated, which is I'm with not with respect to our world, there's nothing equivalent. There's nothing equivalent. There's nothing equivalent to the genius, incredible Indians, and that's the technique the Buddha brought with him that he'd perfected. This ability to completely subdue the grosser levels of conceptuality and sensory. There's a subtle level of mind that is beyond, literally more subtle. And of course, it sounds cosmic because it's not part of our neuroscientific approach, because you can't access it with your conceptual mind. It's beyond conceptual, which just sounds mysterious to us. But that's the more pure, more real level of our mind that we need to unpack, get to, in order to use the mind at a very subtle level to do, like the microscope of the mind, to do the unpacking and unraveling and ridding the mind of the neuroses and of all the misconceptions.
is this path to understanding ourselves and what we are and what we're not better? Is there a quick and easy path to doing that, or is it a kind of a steep and quite hard path to doing it?
Well, I mean, I think the theories are very clear, and that's where they really, they're past masters of it. I mean, this is one of the big emphases in the Tibetan tradition coming from the great Indian monastic university called Nalanda Monastery. You know, Dalai Lama always says, we are Nalanda, you know, these amazing genius scholars and yogis, the authors of so much of the literature over the centuries. Um, oh, now I forgot what I was saying. I got run away with my own silly words. What was the question?
Well, we're just
Sorry.
talking about the
Oh
path.
yeah, difficult and easy. Oh yeah, okay. You can say it so easily. I think the theory can be very encouraging. The essential point the Buddha's making is that the neuroses in the mind, the voices of ego, if you like, and it's not meant to be moralistic, they are the source of our pain. Yes, my boyfriend was mean, but honey child, if you didn't have anger there, you'd be water off a duck's back. And that's like impossible for us. But this is his essential point, that the mind has the potential to be utterly free of the neuroses and full of all the goodness. That's essentially the meaning of nirvana. That's liberation from suffering and its causes. Now that's very delicious to say that, and the path gets you to that. It's helpful to be able to articulate the path. I mean, you can look at, it's very clear. That's encouraging. But to do the job, the Buddha would say that these habits of ego grasping, the root neurosis, believing in this intrinsic me, and then the anger and the jealousy and the attachment, which are the voices of the me, they're deeply entrenched from countless lifetimes of habit. And if even you can posit that point, that it's lifetimes of habit, my habit, that don't come from mummy and daddy, then we can see how entrenched they are and how hard they are to even notice them, to even recognize that they're problems. So it is a long, slow, steady path. Sometimes up and sometimes down for sure. But be able to articulate what the path is, that's encouraging, I think. It's not some mysterious thing you cross your fingers and hope for the best. That's what I liked. That's why I felt very attracted when I heard these Tibetans, when I first met them in the 70s. That's what grabbed me. That's when I really felt that what my mind had been missing was this incredible clarity of the precision of the presentation of what mind is at a most deep level, and even including the physical world. I mean, Dalai Lama's got these amazing one book. They deal with the external reality. These Indians were geniuses at understanding the physical universe, you know. So all that was there, and I found that super appealing. That's what I've been looking for, I think, for myself.
I sometimes say simple but not easy.
No, that's no simple. I think any good scientist who really knows their stuff, they present it so simply. So I think if you're only intellectual, it'll just sound like gobbledygook. So if you're practicing it, put your money where your mouth is. I see that with any of the teachers I've got. They present it and it's so encouraging. Wow, that's doable, you know? And that's really important, I think.
So what is a meaningful life from a Buddhist perspective? You know,
I understand. It's a very good point. Well, I mean, you know, the bird has two wings, wisdom and compassion. Depends on where you're at. So, you know, if the first stages of practice is the wisdom one, as Dalai Lama says, compassion is not enough. You can have empathy, but if you don't know how to help, you make a big mess, you know. And what's holding us back, the Buddha's view is what's holding us back from being really effective helping others is our own rubbish. Our own nonsense, rubbish, delusions and neuroses and needs that gets in the way, you know. So the first stages is the wisdom wing. That's really like the meditation mode. The best was to give up sex, drugs, and rock and roll, go to the mountains and achieve liberation, achieve nirvana. Then you can come back and be useful to others. That's the ideal scenario. But most 99% of Buddhists won't even do that either. So you do a bit of both. You've got your own practice, you do your inner stuff, you get to know yourself clearly and well, you make decisions, you lessen your neuroses, grow your goodness, and then you put your money where your mouth is because you're living in the world and be of benefit to others because you realize we're all in the same boat.
mm. So you mentioned before about nirvana. Is nirvana the
Yeah.
same as enlightenment, or what is in
I understand. Well,
enlightenment?
there's different traditions over the centuries, as we know in Buddhism. All different. I mean, when you study in the Tibetan monasteries, you study one of these texts that's called Buddha's Tenets, and somebody's very kindly presented. It's sort of like you've got a text where it puts every single Christian view, all the 39 different schools of thought, and exactly how they differ. It's very helpful. So there's all this what we know as a Theravadan, which is really apparently one of the remaining 18 sub schools of like the Satantrika or the Vibhashika, one of the schools of thought at the time. Then you've got the Mahayana schools of thought, and there's many divisions of those, you know. So there's different levels of these. So the word Buddha. There's many different views. The Theravadins say one thing. Kevin will argue with me. Let him argue. It's all right. He's coming from the Theravadan
We'll
trip.
bring him on.
They say they do posit the possibility of being a Buddha, But their big difference, the Theravadins and the Mahayanas, the Theravadins say once you've achieved nirvana, once you've done the job on yourself, you cleaned up your own mess, then when you die, you disappear into space. There's nothing left. And that's a radical difference. Mahayanas say your consciousness continues, but you can also, so once you've got to the point of any level of, even where you don't need any longer to be born because you've achieved your liberation, there's also you're practicing this other wing, the compassion wing, like an extra level of practice that just compels you to want to come back as a completely enlightened Buddha with no involvement in the rubbish at all, and you're able to be above it, but yet in it to be of benefit to others. So Buddha is another level of nirvana. That's how the Mahayanas would say. There's different levels of nirvana.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of perhaps the last question before we take some questions for
Yeah,
everybody else, the role of meditative and contemplative practices in
yeah.
developing the sort of awareness, and can you tread that path without meditative practices, or are they absolutely intrinsic to giving you
No,
the
I
awareness
understand. No,
of
I
the
understand.
present?
Totally understand. It all depends on the person. I mean, you know, um, like I can see it in some of the Tibetan monasteries, for example, that some of the people, they're little monks since they're born, they go into the monastery and they don't look like they do any practice at all, but they've got this incredible compassion, this empathy. They work for others. They do the kitchen. They do the garden. They're like these little saintly beings. So the Buddhist approach could be that you come into this life already from lots of past practice, and now you can do the compassion side. So it all depends on the person. And this, of course, it's why the view of reincarnation is useful as a point here to take the Buddha's view that you can come into this life highly realized from all the wisdom wing. You've done the job. You don't need to go to the boring old mountains, and you can just get on with it now and help others. Totally. So at a relative level, that's absolutely for sure. And even among all my, for me, of course, I got my inner work, my inner practice, there's no question. But since when I first met the Buddhists, I thought the port of meditation was completely boring. I had not the slightest interest. I mean, I'm a busy girl. Look at me, speedy still, 50 years later. I had no interest in taking that approach full time. Some of my friends went straight to the meditative and spent their last 50 years mainly doing that. So you got to know where you're at and what you need to do. You got to know yourself well.
Are there different natures suited for different, like a
Absolutely.
meditative path,
No, I think there's no
service
question.
path, or
Yeah, I mean the service one
intellectual?
is huge. If you can benefit, and the Buddhist view is if the law of karma is that everything you think and do and say programs you, then if you're out there being compassionate and kind, I mean, what kind of programming is that? That's amazing. And then you die, you carry on and keep moving. It's a long-term thing.
Yeah.
So it all depends on the person and what's appropriate for them at different times.
Okay, excellent. We'll bring Kevin back in. And Kevin,
Yeah.
I hope we've got a few questions waiting.
We have a lot of questions. We have a
Okay.
lot of questions there. And
Good.
Robina, I'm not
Good.
going to get into an argument with you about Theravada and
We
Tibet.
will not do that.
We will. That's way too much inside Buddhist baseball for the people that are there.
That's right.
By the
Yeah,
way,
okay.
there's about 140 people today, and they're from all over the world. So this is
Wonderful. So
really
good.
lovely to see.
I wish I
everyone.
could see your faces. I'm so sorry I can't.
So there are a lot of questions coming in. So what I'm going to try to do is maybe
Yeah.
blend a few.
Synthesizer, maybe.
Yeah. So there's one question about what is your opinion on kind of psychological approaches to and counseling based approaches to Buddhism? Is there a way that's like some of them seem to fit together well? And just as
I think there's no question.
as a second
I think
part
a
of that
great,
question,
great question. Yeah.
somebody's also asking is like, what's the kind of the Buddhist approach to maybe like different kind of neurological structures that maybe cause chemical imbalances that
I see. Okay.
mental
No,
health?
good point. Thank you.
What about
Okay.
meditation in these instances? So
Yeah,
just
all of
your
this.
general
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Okay. So first of all, we take this view that your consciousness or your mind, and these words are synonymous in Buddhism, by definition are not physical. We just have to take that as a hypothesis here. That's how Buddha's talking. And he knows that's from his observation. He just didn't make it up. So it doesn't mean we don't have a brain or a body or chemicals and all the rest, of course. But so they have an intimate and interdependent relationship. So it's really clear that's true. So the Buddha would say the mind is the main thing, but meaning one's own personal subjective process of cognition. And then, of course, depending on how the brain is functioning, if its brain's kind of a bit weird, then the stuff comes out crooked, but your mind can still be very clear. So those all play a role in our lives. And that's like having only one leg instead of two, or not being healthy. The physical does play a role, but they're still literally separate, but they work interdependently. So that's the one point. But then absolutely, I mean, if you look at the word psychology, we love putting words into Greek. For God, no, I mean that's a European culture. As soon as it's fancy, it's Greek. So we give it this special meaning. Well, Buddha didn't speak Greek; he spoke Hindi or whatever he spoke. And the word is mind. So consciousness and mind are synonymous. Well, what's that? It's psychology. Like one of my teachers, Lama Yeshe, would say, we need to be our own therapist, and it's literally true. So, bottom line in Buddhism, if you can find any human being who can help you sort out what the hell's going on inside you, that's amazing. That's what Buddha's trying to do. Whether you have a person you go to and pay, or whether you do it yourself, no difference. So, being a therapist who studied Buddhism, marvelous. It supports your ability to help other people. How fantastic! Marvelous. Whatever, not a problem.
Nice, very, very balanced perspective. So we'll
Yeah.
just kind of shift gears a little bit here.
Yeah.
And just, I think sorry, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Kuwani asked a question about, it seems that both positive and negative mind states, from a Buddhist perspective, are something that is conditioned. And they're things that are temporary in this kind of way.
Yeah.
But so how does that square with this Buddhist idea that the mind is like originally pure?
I hear.
Yeah.
No, it's a good point.
Fundamental
No, I know.
conditioning change in with that?
These words are tricky, Kevin. I think I see these words are tricky because that's not the Buddhist view at all. It can't be. That's where you have a discussion with the Christians. I know with one of my Catholic priest friends, they all say we began as totally pure and then we were naughty. But the Buddhist view would be if you are a product of a creator, God, a perfect being, and he creates somebody or she, what they create has to be an extension of themselves. It can't, therefore, if you've removed all the neuroses from the mind, it's never possible. In other words, in the Buddhist view, if you've achieved nirvana, you've cut the root of all the rubbish. You can never, ever, ever get the rubbish back. It is impossible to kind of get mucky again. Not possible. So originally pure is just a word they often use to mean in our true nature. It's pure. But don't think we were pure once and then lost it. From the Buddhist view, that's not viable. It's not possible. But that's why nirvana, once you've achieved this liberation from suffering and its causes by removing all the rubbish from the mind, then you have achieved your pure potential. Put it like that.
Nice, wonderful. And I'm gonna throw the big curveball that we all face as Buddhists in some way. The question that we all kind of face is like, well,
yeah, what's that?
okay, so the Buddhists have this idea that that something is reincarnated after
Okay,
it goes
right.
away.
Yeah,
And so
sure.
the question that I think it's Gilan actually. Oh, sorry, it is. I've lost the name.
God.
Yeah, Galan. Basically, like if the brain basically dies at death, what is it? And the brain is the source of our personality and who we are. What is it that
Yeah, I
actually
understand.
moves from life
I
to
understand.
life?
Well, Buddha would not say. Buddha would say that the brain is not the basis of our personality. Like I always say, I'm not trying to insult you, neuroscientists and the people. This is the prevailing view in the world. That what you could say that the Buddhist approach is that what goes on in the physical world, the chemicals, the body, the DNA, the genes, the brain, these are physical indicators of what's going on in the mind. So consciousness is not physical. Consciousness or mind are not physical, but they're conjoined with and interdependently related to and affected every second by the physical. But the crucial thing in Buddhism, they're separate entities. They're separate but interdependent. So we've got the grosser level, sensory consciousness, subtler level, much subtler level, mental consciousness, and certainly in the Tibetan tradition, the Vajrayana, they've got these very detailed, interesting, sophisticated analysis and presentation of how you go through the death process, and meditators can replicate that. How you go from the grosser level to the subtle, to the very subtle, to the very subtle. So finally, consciousness at the very subtlest level before you die, you've gone to the subtlest level of your consciousness. That all the grosser levels have ceased, all the grossest physicality has ceased, and this very subtle level of consciousness, holding all the karmic imprints of everything you ever thought and done and said, like a store, that then program leaves the body, and then due to the compulsion of your own virtuous called negative karma, you find your way to another womb. It's your consciousness that carries on, but at a very subtle level of it's consciousness. That's where it does differ from the Theravadan. From the Mahayana, it's beginningless and it's endless. So conscious continues on, programmed by your what you've done and thought and said. So in other words, Dalai Lama says we like create our own selves, but your consciousness continues. Your consciousness, not your brain, obviously. Your consciousness, your subtler physical, your subtler non-physical energy, your consciousness. That's how they say.
Very nice. And
that's synonymous with the word mind.
Nice. And so, yeah, actually, very good. Building on that, I think it's Nicola that asked a question. Somebody else asked a similar kind of question as well.
Yeah.
Okay, if consciousness is the mind in this way, and Buddhists have this idea about emptiness, like, well, what actually is emptiness within consciousness?
I mean, you asked this question with 3 minutes to go, so we'll see what we can do, okay? Basically, what the Buddha is saying, as I suggested before with Craig, we are a person. I'm Robina. There's Venerable Kevin. There's Craig. And then we have thoughts. We have negative thoughts, unhappy, anger, ego-based drama queens in us. And we have the valid, useful, compassion, empathy, wisdom, kindness, blah, blah. So you sort yourself out. You less and less and less in the rubbish. Grow the goodness. And then and then... No, so I lose my track. So I think it's old age. God almighty. What was the point we're saying? What was the point? Quick, Kevin.
Oh, quick. So basically,
emptiness.
Consciousness,
got it,
how do we understand emptiness within consciousness?
All Buddha's meaning is this. We have this deep intrinsic belief that there is a little me in there, a little kind of mini me that's the boss. And our language expresses it. I did this and I decide that. And we completely exaggerate that sense of I. So he says there is the sense of I the I that we think is there isn't. So basically, all he's saying is that the I we think is there isn't. So we have to discover that isn't. We have to discover the absence of it. It's sort of like you really believe that your iPad is in the lounge room. When you discover, when you go in there and you find it's finally not, it's a shock to realize, oh my God, my iPad's not here. You just discover the absence of the iPad. So you have to discover the absence of that fantasy I. They say, and Lama Zopa says, when you're finally in the subtlest meditation, when the penny drops and you've quote unquote realized emptiness, what's happening is you finally realize with a subtle level of your mind, like the microscope of your mind, nakedly for the first time, that fantasy drama queen in there has never, doesn't, and can never exist. And then he says for the greatest yogis, that's the most blissful experience on the planet. But it can also be very fearful. So you realize that the I you thought was there isn't. So you realize the absence or the emptiness of that I. That's the way to say it. You realize the reality is that I has never existed. It's like we're colorblind. You've always believed something that doesn't exist. And it's only at the subtle level of mind in meditation, because the mistake is so utter, that we can finally see that emptiness, realize that. That's the way of saying it. All right?
Absolutely. Perfect answer, and you did it in 3 minutes. That's really good. So we're at the top of the hour now, so I'll hand back over to Craig to close out the session. And just for myself, really thankful for you being here, and also so many people with so many questions and so many people in the chat.
It's a great pity we can't cover them, isn't it? I'm so sorry.
Well, we might have to make this a 5-hour seminar today, and but I think in the time that we've had, you've probably covered life, the universe, and just about everything, Robina. So
well, good. I'm happy. No, it's good. I'm happy. I like these conversations with human beings. It's wonderful.
And you managed.
So I can say to people, keep moving. Don't give up. Look, don't give up. Look. Check. Keep moving, and have this confidence in your own amazing potential. That's what should drive it.
And thank you so much today for sharing your time with us, but also your passion and enthusiasm, which I can tell has not dimmed over these 50 years.
I know. I keep thinking as I get older, I'll get kind of lazier and kind of go slowly, but it hasn't happened yet.
Well, thank you to everybody joining us today, and we'll look forward to being with everybody again for our next seminar. And
good. But I've got like 30 seconds. Can I sing a 30-second prayer?
Sure.
Okay. So it's in Tibetan, and it says a tiny prayer that just may compassion grow and grow in the hearts of all. I'll just sing it. Sorry, wrong one. Jangchob semcho grimpoche ma kiepanam kegyuchig kiepan yampa mepayang gongne gongdu pelbasho.